"What's an old black man like you doing in a place like this?" The officer sneered as he stepped out of the squad car, eyes scanning Luther Grant like he was a stain on the sidewalk. They didn't check his name. They didn't care. To them, he was just another nobody loitering outside a high-end restaurant. They threw him in the back of a squad car, mocked him in the holding cell, and laughed when he warned them they were making a mistake. They saw an old man who should be afraid of them, a black man whose words didn't matter. But they didn't know they had just arrested Luther Grant, a retired Supreme Court justice. And when he made his phone call, it wouldn't be to a lawyer. It would be to the Chief Justice of the United States. By the time they realized who he was, it would be far too late. Because this time, the black man they tried to silence would be the one who wrote the laws they had broken. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The city hummed with the quiet arrogance of wealth. A world built on glass towers and polished sidewalks, the Hamilton stood at the heart of it all. A restaurant of whispered reservations and exclusive clientele. The kind of place where the doormen held their posts like sentinels, guarding the threshold between privilege and those who did not belong. Luther Grant stood just outside its entrance, wrapped in the quiet patience of a man who had seen too much to be in a hurry. He had arrived a few minutes early, as was his habit, preferring to collect his thoughts rather than rush through time as younger men did. His granddaughter, Claire, was inside finishing up an event with some colleagues from Georgetown Law, a dinner he had politely declined, allowing her the space to navigate the circles of ambition on her own. He had told her to take her time. He would be right here when she was ready. He glanced at the street, at the passing taxis, and the slow-moving luxury cars pulling up to the valet. It had been years since he had allowed himself the leisure of standing unnoticed, of blending into the city without whispers of recognition trailing behind him. Even now, he felt the occasional glance, the fleeting curiosity in the eyes of pedestrians who perhaps thought they had seen his face before, though they could not place it. He preferred it this way. Anonymity had always been a luxury of its own. Across the street, a squad car idled near the curb, its engine a low growl against the quiet murmur of the night. The two officers inside had been watching him for several minutes now, their conversation tapering off as they traded glances, their easy laughter giving way to something colder, something unspoken, but understood between men who had drawn their conclusions long before facts entered the equation. Officer Jake Rourke tapped his fingers against the steering wheel, his gaze fixed on the elderly black man standing alone outside the high-end restaurant. "Look at this guy," he muttered, shaking his head with an amused smirk. "They always find their way into places they don't belong." Brent Kincaid, the older of the two, exhaled through his nose, his jaw tightening as he watched Luther adjust his coat with practiced elegance. "I swear, they're getting bolder every year," he muttered. "Bet you anything he's waiting to hit someone up for cash. Probably tailing one of these rich folks when they leave." Rourke chuckled under his breath, pushing open the door as he stepped out. "Guess we better make sure he doesn't get too comfortable." Kincaid followed, adjusting his belt as they crossed the street with the slow, deliberate stride of men who expected compliance before they had even spoken. Luther did not turn when he heard the footsteps approaching, nor did he startle when the voice came, thick with authority and unearned confidence. "Sir, we're gonna need you to move along." He inhaled evenly, allowing the moment to settle before shifting his gaze toward the two officers standing before him. Rourke had a smirk curling at the edge of his mouth, his stance just slightly too casual, the posture of a man who enjoyed moments like these. Kincaid stood with his hands on his belt, fingers idly brushing the grip of his baton, his expression one of quiet amusement, as though he had already decided how this interaction would end. Luther studied them both for a long, silent moment before speaking, his voice smooth and measured, unshaken by the weight of their stares. "I'm waiting for my granddaughter," he said simply. Rourke's smirk widened, his head tilting slightly as he let out a quiet scoff. He said, dragging the syllables out like a man humoring a child's excuse. See? That's the thing. You've been standing here for a while now, and we've had a few complaints about suspicious activity. Can't have people loitering outside a nice place like this. Luther held his gaze, unblinking. Suspicious activity, he repeated, his tone devoid of curiosity, because he had no need to ask what they meant. Kincaid exhaled, shaking his head as if the whole thing was some minor inconvenience. Just move along, all right? We won't ask twice. Luther did not move, nor did his expression change. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his coat, slow and deliberate, his movements precise as he retrieved his wallet and held it out. I assume you'll want to see some identification then, he said, his voice steady. There was a flicker of hesitation, a brief moment where Kincaid's jaw tightened just slightly, a sliver of irritation crossing his face at the audacity of the man before him. He glanced at Rourke, whose smirk had faded, replaced by something harder, something less amused. Then, without warning, Rourke reached out and slapped the wallet from Luther's hand. It hit the pavement with a dull sound, landing just beside the curb, a scattering of crisp bills and neatly stacked cards spilling out onto the concrete. Luther did not flinch. For the first time, his expression shifted, not to anger, not to fear, but to something far more unsettling in its stillness, a patience so practiced, so deeply ingrained, that it became something more than silence. Kincaid stepped forward, his boot coming down firmly onto the wallet, pressing it into the cold pavement. Didn't ask for ID, he muttered, his voice just barely above a sneer. Rourke let out a short, humorless chuckle. You got a problem with following directions, old man? Luther's hands remained at his sides, his shoulders squared, his posture unyielding. He did not look at the wallet crushed beneath Kincaid's boot. He did not look at Rourke's smug expression. Instead, he let the moment stretch between them, let the weight of their actions settle in the air, and then, with quiet certainty, he spoke. You are making a mistake. Kincaid exhaled sharply, shaking his head as he leaned in just slightly, his voice dropping low. Yeah, he murmured. And what exactly do you think is going to happen here, huh? Luther's eyes did not waver. You're going to find out, he said. And in that moment, the air shifted, just slightly. Something neither officer could quite name, a thread of something unspoken, but tangible. A quiet warning that neither of them had the sense to heed, because they had already decided how this would end, and they were about to realize just how wrong they were. Luther remained standing exactly where he was, his posture as composed as ever, his eyes unwavering as they met Kincaid's sneering gaze. The weight of the moment settled between them like a stone, thick with the kind of tension that only ignorance and arrogance could create. The officers were waiting for him to break, waiting for the first sign of defiance, the first flicker of anything they could twist into justification. But Luther had spent a lifetime studying men like these, men who mistook power for righteousness, who mistook authority for wisdom. He would not give them what they wanted. Kincaid pressed his boot harder against the wallet, grinding it slightly into the pavement, his lips curling at the edges, as though daring Luther to protest. You're not hearing us, old man, he said, his voice laced with the easy confidence of someone who had never once faced consequences. You've got about 3 seconds to start walking before we make you. Luther did not move. I have told you already, he said, his voice even and deliberate, the kind of voice that had once filled courtrooms, that had delivered judgments shaping the very fabric of this country. I am waiting for my granddaughter. I am standing on a public sidewalk. You have no legal grounds to remove me. Rourke let out a sharp laugh, stepping closer, close enough that Luther could smell the faint traces of cheap cologne and coffee on his breath. Oh, we don't, he said, his grin widening, his fingers twitching slightly at his belt. See, I don't think you understand how this works. You don't get to tell us what we can and can't do. Kincaid nudged the wallet aside with the edge of his boot, watching as one of Luther's credit cards slid out onto the pavement. That's funny, he muttered. Guy like you? Standing around a place like this, all alone at this hour? Bet if I ran that card, we'd find out it's stolen. The accusation sat between them. Deliberate, absurd in its audacity, and yet delivered with such practiced ease that it was clear neither of them expected to be challenged. Luther let out a slow breath, steadying himself, though not from anger. Anger was a luxury he had long since learned to set aside. No, what filled him now was something colder, something tempered by decades of knowing precisely how moments like these unfolded. "I suggest you rethink what you are about to do," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying all the weight of certainty. Kincaid's smile faltered for just a second, barely perceptible, but Rourke stepped forward, filling the silence with something uglier. "Yeah," he sneered, reaching out and gripping Luther's arm with a sudden, forceful yank. "You suggesting we need a damn permission slip to do our jobs?" Luther did not resist. Even as Kincaid stepped in, his hands pressing against Luther's back with unnecessary force, even as he felt the grip tightening around his wrist, even as Rourke twisted his arm just enough to be uncomfortable, but not enough to leave bruises that would show through a courtroom sleeve, he did not resist. Because he knew the law, and more importantly, he knew what was about to happen. "You are making a mistake," he said again, the words slow and deliberate. Rourke chuckled, shoving him toward the squad car. "Yeah, you keep saying that. But you know what I think? I think your biggest mistake was not leaving when you had the chance." The sound of hurried footsteps cracked through the cold air, followed by a sharp, urgent voice that sliced through the night like a blade. "Get your hands off him!" Claire's voice rang out, clear and sharp, laced with the kind of fury that did not beg for attention but demanded it. She was moving fast, her heels clicking against the pavement as she broke into a near run, her breath sharp with disbelief and anger as she saw her grandfather being manhandled like a common criminal. Rourke and Kincaid barely spared her a glance. "Ma'am, step back," Kincaid said without looking at her, his tone bored, dismissive, the same tone used on people they considered irrelevant. Claire's eyes widened, her heart hammering against her ribs as she came to a sudden stop just a few feet away, her gaze snapping between the two officers and the composed yet unmistakably restrained figure of her grandfather. "This is a mistake," she said quickly, the urgency thick in her voice, her hands shaking as she reached into her coat pocket and yanked out her phone. "That man is Luther Grant. Justice Luther Grant. He is a retired Supreme Court justice. Do you even understand what you're doing right now?" The words landed with force, not just because of what they meant, but because Claire did not sound like a woman pleading for sense. She sounded like a prosecutor presenting evidence before a jury. For the first time, Rourke hesitated, his grip loosening slightly. Kincaid frowned, his gaze flickering briefly toward Luther, as if suddenly, for the first time, he was actually looking at the man in front of him, and not just the black body they had already judged guilty. But then the moment passed, and Rourke scoffed, shaking his head, his smirk returning with an ease that sent a cold chill through Claire's spine. "Oh, yeah?" he said, tossing a glance at Kincaid. "A Supreme Court justice, huh?" Kincaid let out a slow, deliberate chuckle. "Well, isn't that cute?" he muttered, grabbing the cuffs from his belt. "Looks like Grandpa's been telling bedtime stories." Claire's breath caught in her throat, her fingers tightening around her phone as she hit record. The camera now trained directly on the officers as they twisted Luther's arms behind his back and snapped the cold steel cuffs over his wrists. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice shaking now, the realization settling deep in her bones. Rourke grinned, shoving Luther toward the back seat. "Funny," he muttered. "That's exactly what he said." Claire's vision blurred with a rush of fury and helplessness as she watched the door slam shut, the hollow sound reverberating through the night, final and damning. But even as she stared in horror, even as her breath came in sharp, ragged gasps, she caught sight of something else, something that sent a sharp, unexpected chill through her spine. Luther was watching her from the back seat of the car, his posture straight, his hands resting calmly in his lap. And he was not afraid. He was waiting, because he knew something they didn't, because they had made the wrong mistake, and by the time they realized it, there would be no escape. The squad car pulled away from the curb, its flashing lights reflecting in the gleaming glass of the high-rise buildings that lined the streets. A city moving on, oblivious to what had just happened. Inside the vehicle, the air was thick with an arrogance so casual, so unchecked, that it filled every inch of the space, pressing against Luther's skin with the same suffocating weight as the steel around his wrists. Rourke adjusted the rear-view mirror, his grin lazy as he met Luther's gaze through the glass, his fingers drumming idly against the steering wheel as if he were enjoying the hum of a favorite song. Kincaid, in the passenger seat, stretched slightly, rolling his shoulders before twisting just enough to glance over his shoulder at their passenger. "You know," Kincaid drawled, his voice carrying that familiar blend of boredom and cruelty, the tone of a man who had done this too many times to count, "I gotta say, you people never learn." Luther did not react. He had heard it before. The words, the cadence, the inflection. It always started the same way. Something off-handed, something meant to sound casual, like an afterthought, but laced with the kind of ugliness that could curdle in a man's gut. He did not flinch. He did not shift. He simply waited. Rourke chuckled, shaking his head, his grip loose on the wheel as he took the next turn. "Yeah, man, it's like, what's the play here, huh?" he mused, exchanging a smirk with Kincaid. "You think if you wear the nice coat, stand outside the fancy places, you get a little respect? That how it works?" Luther held his gaze in the mirror, his voice smooth, deliberate. "I don't need to earn respect from men like you." Rourke let out a sharp laugh, nudging Kincaid in the arm. "Oh, we got a real classy one, huh?" Kincaid smirked, shaking his head. "Yeah, but that's the thing, though. It don't matter how much you dress it up. Don't matter how old or well-spoken you are. End of the day, you're still just—" Luther didn't blink. "A black man." Silence. The word hung in the air, undeniable, unflinching, cutting through the shallow humor like a scalpel. Kincaid smirked, but something in his posture stiffened, as though he hadn't expected Luther to say it out loud, hadn't expected him to strip the pretense from their little game so effortlessly. Rourke shook his head, scoffing under his breath. "Damn right you are." Kincaid leaned back against the seat, exhaling through his nose, his fingers tapping against his thigh. "And that's the problem, isn't it?" he mused, his voice dropping into something lower, something meant to provoke. "You walk around thinking you belong, thinking you're one of them, thinking just 'cause you dress right and talk right, you get to be something more than what you are." Luther tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "And what is that?" Kincaid smirked. "A problem." There it was. The unspoken truth, spoken plainly, without hesitation, without shame. The word landed with the kind of certainty that men like these carried in their bones, the kind that had been passed down through generations of unchecked power, of leashed violence, of hands gripping batons with the same ease their grandfathers had gripped ropes. Luther exhaled slowly, his wrists shifting slightly against the cuffs. Rourke laughed again, shaking his head. "You know what I don't get?" he said, turning onto a quieter street, the hum of the city fading as they neared the precinct. "You people always talk about how bad it is, always crying about racism this, oppression that. But you never talk about how damn easy you got it now. I mean, come on, you think 50 years ago you'd even be standing in a place like that?" Luther let the silence stretch, studying them both carefully. Then, after a moment, he spoke, his voice carrying that same quiet weight he had wielded in courtrooms, that same deliberate cadence that had unraveled weaker men than these. "Tell me," he said, his tone almost conversational, "do you believe that because the knife is 6 inches deep instead of 12, that means you are not still cutting?" Rourke blinked. Kincaid frowned, his smirk faltering. Luther leaned forward just slightly, the cuffs pressing into his wrists, but he did not care. "You want me to be grateful, Because the wound isn't as deep as it once was, he said, his voice steady, unshaken. Because the hand holding the blade wears a uniform instead of a hood. Because instead of ropes, you use pens. Instead of whips, you use laws. Instead of burning crosses, you burn futures. You want to call it progress, but all you have done is learned how to cut quietly. And now you stand here, asking why the bleeding hasn't stopped. Silence. Rourke's jaw tensed. Kincaid exhaled through his nose, shifting in his seat. Luther settled back against the hard plastic, his eyes meeting Rourke's in the mirror once more. "No," he said simply. "I will not thank you for this." Rourke scoffed, rolling his shoulders as he forced a laugh. But it sounded weaker now, thinner. The previous confidence chipped just slightly at the edges. "Damn, you talk a lot for someone in cuffs," he muttered, shaking his head. "You keep running your mouth, we might just have to take a little detour. Show you how things used to be done." Kincaid smirked. "Yeah, maybe take a wrong turn. Drop you off somewhere they don't ask too many questions." Luther studied them both, absorbing their every word, every flicker of expression, filing them away carefully, precisely. And then, after a long moment, he exhaled, his shoulders easing, his face settling into something eerily calm, something practiced. "Enjoy this while it lasts," he said softly. Rourke frowned, his fingers flexing slightly against the wheel. "What the hell's that supposed to mean?" Luther tilted his head slightly, a quiet amusement settling into his gaze, something so slight, so subtle, that it sent a prickle of unease down Kincaid's spine. "It means you should savor these last few moments," Luther murmured, "because you do not yet realize what you have done." Kincaid scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Oh yeah, and what exactly have we done?" Luther held his gaze, letting the weight of his silence press against them, letting the anticipation settle. The slow, creeping realization that something was wrong beginning to take root in the back of their minds. And then, finally, just as they pulled into the precinct parking lot, just as the first flicker of hesitation crossed Rourke's face, just as Kincaid's smirk faltered, Luther smiled. "You'll find out soon enough." And as the car came to a stop, as the weight of the moment settled into the space between them, neither officer could shake the feeling that something had just shifted. Something was coming. And for the first time since the night had begun, they were the ones who should have been afraid. The squad car pulled into the precinct lot, the red and blue lights reflecting off the damp pavement, illuminating the weary brick walls of a station that had seen its fair share of men processed through its doors, though very few had ever walked out with their dignity intact. The station was quiet at this hour, a few officers lingering near their desks, finishing up paperwork, cracking tired jokes, sipping stale coffee from dented thermoses. It was a slow night, the kind that invited complacency, the kind that let men like Rourke and Kincaid feel untouchable. Inside the vehicle, Luther Grant remained where he was, his hands still cuffed, his posture still composed, his expression still carrying that unbearable patience that had begun to unsettle the men in front of him. Rourke let out a dramatic sigh, drumming his fingers against the steering wheel before cutting the engine, glancing at Kincaid. "Well, that was fun," he muttered, smirking. "Nothing like reminding the locals who's in charge, huh?" Kincaid chuckled, stretching as he undid his seatbelt, his grin widening as he twisted slightly in his seat to face Luther. "Yeah, you did real good back there, old man," he said, his voice thick with condescension. "Kept your mouth shut. Didn't fight back. Smart move." Luther met his gaze through the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable, his silence unwavering. Kincaid tilted his head, watching him carefully, his smirk lingering, but not quite as comfortable as before. "Thing is, though," he continued, his tone shifting just slightly, laced now with something sharper, something meant to provoke, "you know why we stopped you. You know why you're here. You ain't stupid." Rourke scoffed, unbuckling his seatbelt as well. "Oh, come on, Kincaid. You really think he doesn't already know?" He turned, his elbow resting casually on the headrest, his smirk widening. It's got nothing to do with vagrancy. It's got nothing to do with loitering. Hell, it's not even about compliance, is it? He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly, his smirk curling into something uglier. It's about what it's always been about. Kincaid exhaled through his nose, nodding slightly, his smirk fading into something colder. Luther did not blink. "You should just say it," he murmured, his voice steady, smooth as silk stretched taut over steel. Rourke grinned wider. "All right, fine. It's about the fact that you don't belong." Kincaid chuckled. "There it is." Luther inhaled slowly, letting their words settle, absorbing them with the same patience he had carried his entire life, the same patience that had built courtrooms around men like them, men who thought they were wolves, but were, in the end, nothing more than dogs let off the leash. "You don't like seeing a black man in a place you think is too nice for him," he said, his voice unshaken, his gaze steady. "You don't like that I wasn't scared of you, that I didn't jump when you barked, that I had the audacity to stand there, waiting, existing, breathing, without needing your permission." Rourke let out a quiet scoff, shaking his head. "Jesus, you people always make it about race." Luther's lips pressed together briefly, his head tilting ever so slightly, the hint of something wry in his gaze. "Isn't it?" Kincaid smirked, leaning back in his seat, shrugging. "I mean, maybe, maybe not. Doesn't really matter, does it? End of the day, you're still in the back of our car, and we're still taking you inside." Luther studied him for a long moment before speaking again, his voice so smooth, so calm, that it sent a prickle of unease down Kincaid's spine before he could explain why. "You think this is over?" he murmured, his voice as patient as the turning of the tide. Rourke let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking his head. "I don't think," he muttered, reaching for the door handle. "I know." Kincaid followed suit, stepping out first, his boots crunching against the gravel, stretching his arms as he made his way around the vehicle. He pulled the door open, reaching in and gripping Luther's arm tighter than necessary, the way men like him always did, as though there were something to prove. Luther did not resist. He had never resisted, and yet Kincaid yanked harder, just because he could. Luther stepped out with the same unwavering composure, letting himself be led inside, his chin lifted, his presence unshaken despite the weight of the cuffs around his wrists. The moment they entered the station, the quiet hum of conversation slowed just slightly, a few glances flickering toward the older black man in the tailored coat, the crispness of his attire an odd contrast to the fluorescent glow of the precinct. But no one looked too long. No one questioned it. O'Malley, the sergeant on duty, barely looked up from his paperwork. "What do we got?" he asked, his voice flat, already reaching for the intake forms before Rourke even opened his mouth. "Vagrancy, loitering, failure to comply." Rourke listed off casually, dropping the file onto the desk. O'Malley grunted in acknowledgement, flipping a page before holding out a hand. "ID?" Kincaid snorted, reaching into his pocket and tossing Luther's wallet onto the counter. "Might want to run it," he muttered. "Something tells me it's not real." Luther exhaled quietly. O'Malley barely glanced at the ID before tossing it aside, waving toward the hallway that led to the holding cells. "Go ahead and process him. He can sit in there till morning." Luther turned his head slightly, his voice as smooth as glass. "I will be making my phone call now." O'Malley sighed, rolling his eyes as he waved a dismissive hand. Yeah. You'll get your call when I say so." Luther did not move. "I will be making my phone call now," he repeated, the weight of his voice filling the space between them like a slow, gathering storm. Rourke scoffed. "Jesus, he thinks he's got rights." O'Malley groaned, waving him off. "Whatever. Let him call his damn lawyer." The precinct hummed with the low murmur of routine, officers moving through their late-night shifts, with the easy confidence of men who had done this 1,000 times before and expected to do it 1,000 times again. The air smelled of stale coffee and sweat, of old paperwork, and the quiet indifference that came with power left unchecked. Luther Grant sat in his holding cell, his hands resting lightly in his lap, his coat folded beside him, his hat placed carefully on top. He had not been given forms to sign. He had not been asked questions. He had been processed in silence, shoved into this room as though his presence here was normal, as though he was just another name in the system, another body behind bars, another black man in a cage. He had made his phone call, and he was waiting. The officers did not know it yet, but the first shifts in their world had already begun. The phone had rung twice before the voice on the other end answered, crisp and efficient. The kind of voice that had spent a lifetime commanding rooms and deciding the fate of the country from behind a bench. Alan Whitmore. Luther had allowed a moment to pass before speaking, letting recognition settle in. Alan. A pause. A sharp intake of breath. The rustle of fabric as the Chief Justice of the United States sat forward in his chair. Luther! Luther adjusted his grip on the receiver, his voice smooth, deliberate, calm. I need you to listen very carefully. The silence that followed was thick, the weight of old cases and long conversations pressing between them. The kind of pause that carried more understanding than words ever could. Where are you? Whitmore's voice had changed, shifting from casual recognition to something sharper, something controlled but edged with the first flickers of concern. Luther let the quiet stretch just a little longer, not out of hesitation, but to let the reality settle before he said it aloud. 17th Precinct. The line went dead silent. Then a slow, measured inhale. What? They arrested me outside the Hamilton, Luther continued, his tone unshaken, controlled, each syllable a scalpel cutting away ignorance and assumption. 2 officers, Rourke and Kincaid. They did not check my identification. They did not ask questions. They assumed I was a vagrant. I informed them otherwise. They did not listen. The sharp click of a pen being dropped. A chair scraping against the floor. Jesus Christ! No, Luther murmured, tilting his head slightly, though the motion was more for himself than for the conversation. Just me. Whitmore exhaled, and Luther could hear it. The shift in breathing, the tightening of posture, the way the very temperature of the conversation changed. He was no longer speaking to an old friend. He was speaking to a man who understood power and knew precisely how to wield it. They booked you. Whitmore's voice was clipped now, the words precise, controlled, the sound of a gavel poised over a courtroom. Not yet, Luther murmured. I suspect they will leave me here overnight. A lesson, perhaps, one they believe I require. Another silence, filled with the sound of Whitmore thinking, his mind moving like a machine, cutting through possibilities and contingencies, calculating destruction. And then, soft but unmistakably lethal, he spoke. That's not going to happen. Luther allowed himself a small, knowing smile, because that was exactly what he had counted on. Whitmore had never been a man who hesitated, never been a man who wasted time with outrage when action was required. He had built his career on precision, on tactical decisions, on knowing when to strike and how hard. He had learned that from Luther himself. And right now, he was angry. Tell me their names again, Whitmore said, his voice low, dangerous in its control. Rourke and Kincaid. And the sergeant on duty? O'Malley. A quiet exhale, followed by fingers drumming against a desk, the telltale sound of a man reaching for a pen, for his phone, for the keys to a kingdom these men did not know they had walked into. You know, Whitmore mused after a moment, his tone now disturbingly even, this precinct has been under quiet scrutiny for years. Civil rights violations, excessive force complaints, a few missing body cam records. Nothing ever big enough to stick, but he let out a slow, thoughtful breath. This, Luther, this sticks. Luther remained silent. There was no need to respond. Whitmore was already moving. I'm making some calls, Whitmore continued, his voice shifting into something sharper, something razor-edged. The Department of Justice will be notified. The Attorney General's office will be notified. Hell, I might just loop in the White House while I'm at it. Let them decide how they want to handle the fact that one of the architects of modern civil rights law has been unlawfully detained by two glorified security guards with badges. A beat. Then, stay exactly where you are. Luther exhaled slowly, his smile widening just slightly. I had no intention of leaving. And then, the line had gone dead. Now, in the holding cell, he could feel it beginning. The officers in the precinct were still laughing, still moving through their routines with the easy arrogance of men who believed power belonged to those who shouted the loudest. But Luther knew better. Power did not belong to those who shouted. It belonged to those who waited. And so, he sat, and he waited, and he smiled, because soon the first phone would ring. And by the time they understood what had happened, by the time they realized just how deep this mistake went, it would be far too late for all of them. The precinct thrummed with a lazy kind of energy, the kind that came with the late hours, when the paperwork was nearly done, the streets had quieted, and the officers on duty could loosen their belts, sip their stale coffee, and talk about nothing of consequence. There was a comfortable rhythm to it, a routine as old as the walls that surrounded them. Arrests made, bookings processed, men thrown into cells to be forgotten until morning. And that was exactly how they saw Luther Grant. Just another name. Just another body in a holding cell. No different than any of the others who had sat on that same metal bench, staring at the same flickering lights, waiting for a bailiff who would never come. Rourke and Kincaid had made their rounds through the station, filling out half-hearted reports, stretching their legs, reliving their earlier victory with smug little quips passed between them, neither one thinking too deeply about the man they had left sitting in the holding cell. But as the night stretched on, something about it began to feel unfinished, because he wasn't reacting. Luther sat in that dimly lit cell with his back straight, his shoulders squared, his hands resting lightly in his lap. He did not pace. He did not fidget. He did not mutter under his breath, or sigh with impatience, or do anything that a man in his position was expected to do. And that made them restless. Because what fun was a caged animal if it didn't thrash? Kincaid was the first to give in to the itch. He had wandered by the holding cell once or twice already, peeking in, tossing a few half-hearted remarks Luther's way, but receiving nothing in return. No argument, no reaction, nothing to sink his teeth into. So, this time, he made it obvious. He leaned against the bars, crossing his arms over his chest, tilting his head slightly as he studied Luther, his lips curling into something amused, something taunting. "You're real quiet, old man," he mused, his tone light, conversational. "That's supposed to be some kind of power move." Luther did not look up. Kincaid chuckled, shaking his head as he nudged Rourke, who had followed behind him with a cup of coffee in hand, sipping leisurely, watching with interest, but without urgency. "I mean, come on. I thought you people loved to talk," Kincaid continued, smirking. "Always got something to say about oppression and injustice and, what is it, systemic this and that. But you're sitting here all polite, like you think if you behave real nice, we might just let you walk out of here." Luther finally glanced up, his gaze slow, deliberate. "You're a fool," he said simply. Rourke snorted, shaking his head. "Yeah, that so?" Luther exhaled, leaning back slightly against the cold metal wall, tilting his head as though studying a peculiar specimen beneath a microscope. "Yes, because only a fool mistakes silence for submission." Kincaid grinned. "Oh, you ain't submitting, huh?" He tapped the bars lightly with his knuckles. "Could have fooled me." Luther held his gaze, unblinking. "I do not need to fight a man who is already drowning." The smirk faltered, just for a second. But before Kincaid could snap back, before the conversation could stretch into something uglier, a new voice cut through the air, gruff and unimpressed. "Knock it off." The three men turned to find Chief of Police Richard Sloane standing a few feet away, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Kincaid straightened slightly, stuffing his hands into his pockets, his smirk lingering but dimmed. "We're just having a little fun, boss." Sloane exhaled sharply through his nose, shaking his head as he took a slow step forward, eyes shifting briefly toward Luther, before landing back on his officers. "Yeah, well, we've got enough crap to deal with. Don't add to it." His tone was not stern, not warning, just tired, because he didn't care. He wasn't stopping them because he found their behavior unacceptable. He wasn't stopping them because he saw a problem with harassing an old black man in a holding cell. He was stopping them because he didn't want to hear about it. Kincaid shrugged, grinning as he took a step back, nudging Rourke. Yeah, we're done here." Rourke took a final sip of his coffee, tossing a smirk toward Luther. "Enjoy your stay," he muttered before turning and walking off, Kincaid following close behind, both of them moving with the easy confidence of men who had been told to stop, but knew they'd never be punished for what they'd already done. Sloane lingered a second longer, his gaze flickering back toward Luther, not with curiosity, not with guilt, but with mild interest, the way a man looks at something that feels vaguely important but is not yet worth his time. Luther held his gaze, his expression unchanged, and then, as if deciding there was nothing worth thinking about here, Sloane turned and walked away. The room settled again. The buzz of conversation returned. The officers went back to their paperwork, to their coffee, to their easy, comfortable lives, completely unaware that they were standing on the precipice of disaster. And then, the front doors opened. It was subtle at first, the slight shift in atmosphere as the cold air from outside swept in, carrying with it the sharp click of heels against tile, the quiet murmur of a voice that did not belong here. The officers at the front desk straightened slightly, some shifting awkwardly, their postures stiffening at the sight of the woman who had just entered, tall, poised, and radiating a presence that did not tolerate dismissal. Claire Grant's eyes were sharp as knives as she strode through the precinct, her hands clenched at her sides, her jaw tight with barely restrained fury. And she was not alone. Beside her, moving with the same unyielding presence, was Assistant U.S. Attorney Daniel Harrington. The first true sign that the walls of this precinct were beginning to crack. And in his cell, seated with the same unwavering patience he had carried all night, Luther Grant let the corner of his lips curve into the barest hint of a smile, because now the real game had begun. And then the first tremor arrived. Claire Grant did not wait to be acknowledged as she strode through the precinct doors, her presence an immediate disturbance, a sharp, deliberate disruption in the careful balance of indifference that this place was built upon. She was moving with purpose, with the kind of controlled fury that did not ask for permission, her every step precise, the sharp click of her heels cutting through the lazy murmur of the officers nearby. But it was not her that made them stiffen. It was the man walking beside her. Assistant U.S. Attorney Daniel Harrington. The moment he entered, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The officers at the front desk straightened, their casual postures tightening into something unnatural, something rigid, their eyes flickering toward each other in quiet, growing concern. They knew who he was. Everyone in this building did. Daniel Harrington had built his reputation in the halls of the Department of Justice with the ruthlessness of a man who never lost. His name was attached to some of the most high-profile cases in the country. His voice a familiar presence in federal courtrooms where lesser men crumbled beneath the weight of his cross-examinations. His reputation was immovable, his influence undeniable, his authority absolute. And now he was here, and he was not smiling. The officer at the front desk, a younger man who had not yet learned how to hide fear properly, swallowed hard, his fingers twitching slightly as he reached for the nearest paperwork, as though holding a clipboard might somehow shield him from what was about to happen. Claire stopped just short of the desk, her eyes sharp, voice clipped and lethal. "I want to see my grandfather." The officer blinked, hesitated for a second too long before clearing his throat. Harrington didn't give him the chance to finish. The attorney took a single step forward, his presence somehow heavier than anyone else's in the room, the kind of presence that demanded attention without ever raising his voice, the kind of presence that made men realize, too late, that they had made a mistake. Where is Justice Grant?" The words were not a request. The young officer's lips parted slightly. His expression caught somewhere between confusion and something resembling genuine panic, because now, the name had been said out loud. And that meant there was no way to ignore it. Justice Grant, Justice Luther Grant, a retired Supreme Court justice, a legal icon, a man whose name should never have been entered into their booking system, whose presence in a holding cell should have been an impossibility. And yet, before the officer could stumble through a response, before he could even decide whether or not he should look toward his superior for help, a heavier, slower step entered the conversation, and Sergeant Tom O'Malley pushed forward, exhaling sharply as he came into view, his expression settling into something casually dismissive, as though he had walked into just another problem that needed solving before his shift ended. "What's going on here?" O'Malley asked, his voice already impatient, his eyes flickering briefly to Claire before landing on Harrington, his brows furrowing slightly in recognition, but not yet in understanding. Harrington turned his gaze toward him, slow and deliberate, assessing him with the kind of cold calculation that could unmake a man in a courtroom. "You're the commanding officer on duty," Harrington stated, and though it was a sentence, it was also an accusation. O'Malley hesitated. It was a fraction of a second, but it was enough. "That's right," he muttered, his jaw tightening slightly. "Sergeant O'Malley. And you are." The silence that followed was deafening, because the entire precinct already knew the answer to that question. Harrington did not blink. "Assistant U.S. Attorney Daniel Harrington." The young officer at the desk stopped breathing. The murmur of casual conversation from the surrounding officers died instantly. O'Malley's lips parted slightly before pressing into a thin line, his mind catching up with the disaster unfolding before him. And for the first time tonight, real, tangible fear entered the room. Harrington did not pause to let the weight of his name settle. He did not wait for O'Malley to fully process how deep the pit beneath him had just become. He simply took another step forward, his voice even, controlled, but carrying the precise weight of a man who was about to dismantle an entire precinct if he did not receive the correct answer. "I am here on behalf of the Department of Justice," he said smoothly, "to investigate the unlawful detainment of a retired Supreme Court justice." A deliberate pause, a slight tilt of his head. "Who, as of this moment, is still in your custody?" O'Malley paled. He recovered quickly, or at least he thought he did, straightening his shoulders, exhaling sharply, rubbing a hand over his mouth before muttering, "Jesus." Harrington did not move. "Where is Justice Grant?" O'Malley hesitated again, glancing toward the hallway, toward the holding cells, toward the place where he had sent a man who should never have been here to begin with. Claire's patience finally snapped. "You put my grandfather in a cell like a common criminal?" she bit out, her voice sharp, her eyes blazing with fury. "And you didn't even bother to check his ID?" O'Malley's jaw tightened. He had nothing to say, because there was nothing he could say. And that silence, that hesitation, that was the moment the officers around him understood that something was deeply, deeply wrong. Harrington inhaled deeply through his nose, exhaled slowly, then tilted his head slightly as he delivered the first true, undeniable order of the night. "Sergeant O'Malley," he said smoothly, his voice as cold as it had ever been inside a federal courtroom, "you are going to take me to Justice Grant, now." And in that moment, with every pair of eyes in the precinct locked onto him, with the full weight of the federal government standing before him, O'Malley knew. This was not a simple mistake. This was not something he could fix with a well-worded excuse. This was the beginning of the end, and there was no way out. The air cracked with unspoken tension, the final second of hesitation hanging between them like a fraying thread. Then, without another word, O'Malley turned sharply on his heel and started toward the hallway, his steps stiff, reluctant, his entire posture that of a man walking toward something he did not want to face. Harrington followed, moving with quiet, controlled precision, his presence filling the space without the need for force. Claire walked beside him, her expression taut, her breathing controlled, but beneath her careful restraint lay a fury that was only growing. The hallway stretched long and narrow, the walls lined with cold, reinforced metal, each step echoing faintly against the concrete floor. The air grew heavier with every inch they covered, the weight of what waited ahead pressing down on O'Malley's shoulders like an unseen force. By the time they reached the holding cells, the sound of muffled voices had faded into the background, replaced by the steady, deliberate rhythm of only one man's breathing. Luther Grant had not moved. He was still seated, still composed, his posture unchanged, his hands resting lightly in his lap. He was waiting. O'Malley hesitated in front of the bars, his fingers curling at his sides, his breath slow and deliberate, as though trying to steady himself before stepping into the moment that would define the rest of his career. Harrington's gaze flickered briefly toward the man in the cell, his expression unreadable, but something shifted in his stance, something subtle, but absolute. He knew. Luther lifted his eyes, locking onto Daniel Harrington, and for the first time that night, something resembling amusement ghosted across his features. Something small, something almost imperceptible, but it was there, and Harrington understood immediately. This was not a man who had been detained. This was not a man who had been arrested. This was a man who had been waiting for them to catch up. O'Malley exhaled slowly, then reached for his keys, his fingers tightening around the metal as he stepped toward the cell door. He did not look at Luther, did not acknowledge him, did not offer an explanation or an excuse. He simply unlocked the door, because there was nothing else to be done. The door swung open with a quiet click, the metal groaning slightly on its hinges, the moment stretching long and taut between them. Luther did not move right away. Instead, he let the silence settle, let the weight of the moment stretch just a little further, before finally, smoothly, he shifted his posture, exhaling slowly, as he pushed himself to his feet, with the quiet, steady ease of a man who had never once doubted how this would end. Claire stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly at her sides, but her voice was strong, unwavering. "Grandfather." Luther's gaze softened as he turned toward her, his lips curving just slightly at the edges. Not quite a smile, but something close. "Claire!" she exhaled sharply, blinking quickly as she reached for him, but before she could speak, before she could unleash the words that had been boiling inside of her since the moment she had seen him taken away, Harrington turned his attention back to O'Malley, his voice sharp, his presence razor-edged. "Sergeant," he said smoothly, his tone carrying the weight of something final, something that did not ask for permission. "I want the arresting officers brought here. Now." O'Malley did not move right away, because he knew the unraveling had begun, and now there was no stopping it. The air inside the precinct had thickened, heavy with the kind of tension that did not settle but pressed, squeezed, suffocated. The laughter that had once drifted from the desks, the casual conversations and the lazy confidence of a night nearly over had been replaced by something else, a silence that carried weight. Sergeant O'Malley stood stiffly in the hallway, his hand gripping the keys he had used to unlock the holding cell, his knuckles white, his breathing tight and controlled. The presence of Daniel Harrington still loomed beside him, a force that could not be ignored, a presence that could unmake careers with a single sentence. But it wasn't just him. It was Luther Grant, standing outside the cell now, untouched, unmoved, unbroken. It was Claire Grant, her hands clenched at her sides, her jaw tight with barely contained fury. It was the understanding that whatever had existed in this precinct before tonight was gone, and in its place, something far worse had settled in, a reckoning that could not be avoided. O'Malley exhaled sharply, shifting his weight from foot to foot, his fingers still curled around the key ring as if it might somehow anchor him. He turned slightly, glancing toward the front of the station, where the voices of officers had dulled into cautious whispers, where the weight of something unseen but felt was creeping under the surface, waiting to erupt. And then the captain's door opened. The noise in the precinct died instantly. For a moment, the hallway stood frozen, the officers pausing mid-step, mid-conversation, their attention snapping toward the man who had just stepped out, Captain Richard Sloane. But this was not the same man who had dismissed Rourke and Kincaid's behavior earlier in the night, the same man who had told them to knock it off with a sigh and a roll of his eyes. This was a man who had just received a phone call that had shaken him to his core. His face was pale, his lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line, his hands slightly unsteady as he adjusted the sleeves of his uniform in a fruitless attempt to appear composed. But the slight tremor in his fingers, the faint sheen of sweat at his temple, the way his breath hitched just slightly before he spoke, those were the tells of a man who had just heard something he could not ignore. O'Malley knew that look. He had seen it before, not on Sloane, but on other men. Men who had miscalculated, who had overstepped, who had made the kind of mistake that did not fade quietly into the background. And for the first time tonight, O'Malley felt it too. Real, tangible fear. Sloane took another breath, running a hand over his face as if that might steady him, then exhaled through his nose, his voice unnaturally controlled when he finally spoke. "Sergeant." His tone lacked its usual authority. "Where are the officers who made the arrest?" O'Malley didn't answer right away, his mouth opening slightly before closing again, his mind racing through responses, through ways to lessen the damage, to shift the weight of what was happening somewhere else, anywhere else. But there was no way out. He cleared his throat. "Rourke and Kincaid are still on shift," he said carefully. "I can bring them in." Sloane's jaw ticked slightly. "Bring them in, now." O'Malley did not argue. He turned, his steps less steady now, his confidence eroding with every passing second as he moved toward the main office, his fingers tightening into a fist as he pushed open the door to the break room. Inside, Rourke and Kincaid sat at the table, still oblivious, still smirking, still talking like men who had not yet realized they were standing in quicksand. Rourke had his feet up on a chair, balancing lazily on the back two legs, sipping at a bottle of soda while Kincaid flicked through his phone, the screen casting a faint glow over his face. O'Malley exhaled sharply, stepping inside fully before shoving the door shut behind him. The sound of it slamming against the frame made both officers glance up, their smirks flickering just slightly at the sight of O'Malley's expression. Neither of them had ever seen him look like that before. "What's up, Sarge?" Rourke asked, his voice still light, but now laced with the first hints of uncertainty. O'Malley's jaw clenched, his hands curling into fists. "Get up," Kincaid frowned. "What?" "I said get up." The cold bite in his tone sent something crawling beneath their skin, something uncomfortable, something neither of them knew how to name. Kincaid straightened slightly, glancing at Rourke, then scoffed under his breath as he shoved his phone into his pocket. "Jesus. All right. What's the big deal?" O'Malley didn't answer. He just stepped back, motioning sharply for them to follow. They exchanged another glance, one that carried more tension now, before finally pushing themselves to their feet and following him out of the room, their steps a little slower, a little less certain. And the moment they stepped into the hallway, the moment they saw the way the entire precinct had changed, they knew the laughter was gone. The casual ease was gone. The air was different now. Rourke's smirk faltered as his gaze landed on Daniel Harrington. Kincaid's breath caught slightly when he saw Captain Sloane standing near the holding cells, his face still pale, his hand still trembling slightly from the phone call that had rattled him to his core. And then their eyes landed on Luther Grant, standing outside the cell, not seated, not detained, not a prisoner, standing, unshaken, watching and smiling. Rourke's pulse kicked against his ribs, something sinking deep into his gut, something cold, something he had never felt before in all the years he had been a cop: dread. Because in that moment, as the realization fully settled in, as Harrington turned to them with slow, deliberate precision, as Sloane exhaled through his teeth, his entire body rigid, as O'Malley stepped back slightly, distancing himself, as Claire's eyes burned into them with a hatred so raw it could have stripped the walls bare, as Luther Grant met their gaze with the quiet, patient certainty of a man who had already won, they finally understood. The power they thought they had, it was gone, and now there was nothing left but the consequences. The room had changed. The walls had not moved. The lighting had not dimmed, but something fundamental in the air had shifted. The weight of consequence was beginning to settle, pressing into the space between the officers who had once laughed, once spoken with casual certainty, once believed themselves untouchable. But there was no certainty now. Daniel Harrington was staring directly at Rourke and Kincaid. There was no hesitation in his stance, no room for misunderstanding in his expression. His presence was a force, not simply because of who he was, but because of what he represented. The full, unrelenting power of the Department of Justice, now turned against the very men who had always assumed it was on their side. The silence stretched long and taut, a moment where the weight of reality settled into the bones of the guilty. And then, suddenly, violently, it shattered. "What the hell were you thinking?" Harrington's voice did not ask. It demanded. The sheer force of it filled the room, cutting through the quiet, making several officers near the front desk flinch, though they weren't even the ones being addressed. The words were not the carefully measured tone he had used before, not the smooth, cutting legal precision of a man slowly working his way toward the kill. This was anger, real, unfiltered, ice-cold rage. Rourke actually took a step back. Kincaid's jaw tightened, his shoulders squaring slightly, as though his body was trying to instinctively protect itself, but he did not speak. Harrington took another step forward, his presence filling every inch of the space between them, his voice rolling over them like a tide that could drown them whole. "You saw an old black man standing outside a restaurant," he hissed, his eyes dark, sharp, dangerous. "And instead of doing your damn job, of checking his ID, of verifying his name, of treating him with even the most basic level of human decency, you threw him in the back of a squad car like he was nothing, like he was no one, like he was yours to handle however you saw fit." His voice dropped, slow and deliberate, his tone turning into something sharper than any weapon. "And you did it all while wearing a badge." Kincaid opened his mouth, but before he could even attempt to summon an excuse, Harrington turned on him fully, eyes blazing, voice a storm. "Shut up!" The words snapped through the air like the crack of a gavel. Final, unarguable, a verdict passed before the trial had even begun. Kincaid's mouth closed immediately. Rourke swallowed, his throat visibly working, but he did not dare speak either. Harrington exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face before his eyes flashed toward Captain Sloane, who had remained silent, standing near the entrance of the holding area as though his feet had turned to stone. "And you," Harrington snapped, his fury shifting seamlessly. "Tell me something, Captain. Did you even bother to review the arrest report before you let these two parade around like they'd done something worth celebrating?" Sloane's lips pressed into a thin line, his skin still pale, his hands still trembling slightly at his sides. But before he could fumble through an explanation that would only dig his grave deeper, another voice entered the conversation. Smooth, calm, devastating. Luther Grant did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His words carried weight not because they were loud, but because they were undeniable. "They didn't even run my ID." The words settled like an earthquake beneath the floor. Kincaid flinched. Rourke looked away. Harrington's head tilted slightly, as though he could not quite believe what he had just heard, as though the sheer stupidity of the revelation had momentarily thrown him off course. He turned his gaze back to Rourke and Kincaid, blinking once, slowly, before his expression hardened into something lethal. "You didn't even run his ID," he repeated, his voice low now, controlled again, but somehow worse than the shouting. "You didn't check his name, his record, his background? You arrested a man and didn't even bother to confirm who he was?" Kincaid's hands curled into fists at his sides, his mouth pressing into a hard line, his silence the only confession necessary. Harrington inhaled deeply, exhaled slowly, and let out a quiet, humorless laugh that held no amusement whatsoever. "Unbelievable," he muttered. The sheer incompetence, the arrogance, the audacity. His gaze burned into them, unrelenting, unflinching. "You arrested a retired Supreme Court justice without so much as a second glance, without even the bare minimum of due diligence. Do you understand the level of stupidity that requires?" Neither of them spoke. They couldn't, because now the full weight of what they had done was pressing down on them, crushing, suffocating, unbearable. Captain Sloane cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably, his hands shaking slightly as he finally pushed himself to move, his body working against the rigid terror keeping him in place. His mouth opened, but no words came, nothing that could salvage what had already been lost. And then, with the resignation of a man who had just realized he was too far gone to recover, he looked toward Rourke and Kincaid. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. "You're both suspended," he said, the words slow, dragging, as though they physically hurt him to say. "Effective immediately." Rourke's face drained of color. Kincaid's jaw clenched so tightly it looked as though his teeth might crack. Neither of them spoke, because what could they possibly say? Sloane swallowed thickly, exhaling as though the act itself had become difficult. "Get your things and get the hell out of my precinct," he finished, voice hoarse, hands still visibly shaking at his sides. And just like that, the first piece fell. The first true consequence settled into place, locking in like a verdict in a courtroom, one that could not be overturned, could not be undone. Luther Grant exhaled softly, his lips curving into something close to a smile, something small, something satisfied, because this was only the beginning. And by the time it was over, they would all understand exactly what it meant to mistake power for protection. The silence that followed Captain Sloane's words was suffocating, thick with inevitability. The weight of what had just been spoken pressed down on the room like a slow, crushing vice, an unshakable force settling over every officer who had witnessed it. Rourke's face had gone pale, his hands twitching at his sides as though trying to grasp something, anything that could ground him. But there was nothing left to hold on to. Kincaid's fingers curled into fists, his shoulders squared in a last-ditch attempt to maintain some illusion of control. But the mask was slipping, the arrogance bleeding from him in slow, painful increments. And then the collapse began. "You're suspending us?" Rourke's voice cracked against the silence, sharp with disbelief, with fear he wasn't ready to name. His head snapped toward Sloane, his breath uneven, his body tight with barely restrained panic. "For what?" "For doing our damn jobs," Sloane exhaled, his lips parting slightly as though he wanted to speak. But there was nothing left to say. He was not in control of this moment, because this was no longer his precinct. Daniel Harrington took a single, measured step forward, his presence towering in its absolute certainty, his words a blade honed to perfection. "For what?" His voice was smooth, but the sheer precision of it made the room feel colder. His eyes burned into Rourke, then Kincaid, locking onto them like they were prey beneath a predator's gaze. "For unlawfully detaining a former Supreme Court justice, for making an arrest without probable cause, for failing to conduct the most basic verification of identity, for disgracing your badge, for violating the very laws you were sworn to uphold." His voice dropped lower, his tone so quietly lethal that it made Kincaid flinch. "And for being too damn stupid to realize what kind of storm you just called down on your own heads." Kincaid's jaw tightened, his breath sharp, but he did not speak, because he knew. Rourke exhaled sharply through his nose, his desperation turning into anger. The only thing left to cling to. This is bullshit. His voice shook slightly, his pulse hammering against his ribs, his muscles tensing under the crushing weight of reality. We didn't do anything wrong. This is just politics. Luther Grant exhaled slowly, shaking his head ever so slightly, his gaze fixed on Rourke with the quiet pity of a man who had seen this argument before, who had watched men like this dig their own graves. "You still don't understand," he murmured, his voice smooth, patient, unshaken. "You thought the badge gave you the power to decide who mattered. You thought your authority was absolute. You thought that because you could act without thinking, you were protected from the consequences of your own ignorance." He tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "You thought wrong." Rourke's hands curled into fists, his pride still reaching for something that no longer existed. But Harrington wasn't finished. "You think this ends with a suspension?" Harrington's tone was almost amused, but there was nothing humorous in his expression. His head tilted slightly, his voice now sharper, colder, final. "Your names are being forwarded to Internal Affairs. Your files will be reviewed by the DOJ. Every complaint against you, every excessive force report, every misconduct allegation that was quietly pushed aside, it will all come to light." Kincaid inhaled sharply, his entire body stiffening. "Your careers are over." Harrington's voice did not rise, did not carry theatrics. It was simply a fact. "Your pensions? In question. Your certifications? Revoked. Your futures? Ruined." He took another slow step forward, watching as Rourke and Kincaid shrank beneath the weight of his words. "And the best part? There isn't a damn thing either of you can do about it." The words settled into the air like a slow-moving wrecking ball, crushing them completely. Rourke's breath stuttered, his chest rising and falling too quickly now, his mind scrambling for something, anything, that could reverse what was happening. But there was nothing left to say, because they had already lost. Captain Sloane, who had remained visibly shaking at the edge of the confrontation, finally cleared his throat, his fingers still twitching slightly, his eyes dark with realization, with fear, with the full crushing weight of what he knew was still to come. This department," he stopped, his voice unsteady, as though each word carried an unbearable weight. He inhaled sharply, then tried again. "What happens next?" Harrington turned his head toward him, his expression unchanging. "An investigation." The single word sent a shudder through the room. Sloane's hands twitched. His eyes darted toward the entrance of the precinct, toward his office, toward the walls that were now closing in on him. We can cooperate," he stammered, his words uneven, his desperation leaking through. "We'll provide full transparency." Harrington let out a short, humorless exhale, something that was not quite a laugh. "You don't have a choice." Sloane swallowed. Luther stepped forward then, his voice calm, smooth, but undeniable. "This isn't just about them," he said quietly, his eyes still locked onto Sloane. "The corruption in this department does not begin and end with 2 officers." He took another step closer, and Sloane did not move. "This precinct is about to become a case study for systemic failure." Sloane's breath hitched. "This is bigger than just Rourke and Kincaid," Harrington continued, his voice as sharp as steel. "This department will be investigated from top to bottom. And if I were you, Captain, I would start preparing for the moment when your name is on the chopping block." Sloane visibly swallowed, his entire body taut, his face ashen, because he knew. His time was running out, too. Harrington straightened, adjusting the cuffs of his sleeves, his tone returning to the sharp, controlled precision of a man who had already won. "For now, these 2 are gone." He motioned toward Rourke and Kincaid, who were still standing frozen in place, their worlds crumbling beneath them. "Captain, I suggest you prepare for what's coming next." Sloane said nothing. He couldn't. Luther inhaled deeply, his gaze sweeping over the officers still standing, still watching, still waiting for what came next. And then, slowly, he exhaled, his voice smooth, steady, final. "Let's go." Claire stepped forward, her fingers tightening slightly at her sides, but her expression was lighter now, her posture no longer tense, and together they turned. They did not wait for an escort. They did not wait for permission. They simply walked. The doors opened before them, and as they stepped into the crisp night air, justice followed them. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the private conference room in the Supreme Court building, Washington, D.C., casting long golden streaks across the polished wood of the table where Luther Grant sat, composed as ever. Across from him, Chief Justice Alan Whitmore was skimming through the file in front of him, his brow furrowed in concentration, the weight of the last 24 hours evident in the subtle tightness of his shoulders. Luther waited. He had spent decades understanding the way power moved, the way it shifted hands, the way it shaped itself around those who wielded it well. And right now, he knew Alan was processing everything not just as a legal mind, not just as a government official, but as a man watching an institution buckle under the weight of its own corruption. Alan finally exhaled, shutting the file with a quiet thud, his fingers still resting on the cover, tracing the embossed DOJ seal. "It's happening," he said simply. Luther nodded once, his expression unreadable. "How fast?" Alan leaned back slightly, adjusting his glasses, his tone clipped, precise. "The 17th Precinct is being ripped apart at the seams. Federal oversight begins next week, but unofficially, it's already started. The officers involved are done. Rourke and Kincaid's careers are over. Internal Affairs has uncovered at least 7 others with disciplinary records that should have gotten them dismissed years ago. Some of them are resigning quietly, trying to escape the fallout before it reaches them." Luther exhaled slowly, nodding once. "And Sloan?" Alan's lips pressed into a thin line. "Resignation letter is already drafted. He's negotiating the terms of his exit, but it's only a matter of time. The governor wants to distance himself before this turns into a full-blown public scandal." He tilted his head slightly. "He'll be gone before the end of the week." Luther didn't smile, but the satisfaction in his eyes was unmistakable. Alan watched him for a moment before shaking his head slightly, his own expression unreadable. "This isn't stopping with one precinct, Luther." Luther leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped on the table, his voice smooth, steady, but carrying an unmistakable weight. "It never was." Alan let out a breath that was not quite a sigh, not quite a laugh. "No, I suppose it wasn't." He tapped the file once, almost absent-mindedly. "The DOJ is expanding the review to other precincts in the district. Once the first domino falls, the rest tend to follow." Luther nodded again, slowly, as though he had already known this, as though this had been the plan all along. Alan studied him for a long moment before leaning forward as well, his voice quieter now, but not uncertain. "You realize what this means, don't you?" Luther met his gaze without hesitation. "I do." Alan exhaled through his nose. "This isn't just a departmental shake-up. It's not just an investigation into a few bad officers. This is about to turn into something much, much bigger." He let the words settle before adding, "And it's not going to be easy." Luther let the silence stretch between them for a long moment, before he finally spoke, his voice calm, his certainty absolute. "Nothing worth fighting forever is." Alan studied him again, his gaze flickering with something that almost resembled amusement, before he smiled, just slightly. "Then, let's make sure we finish what they started." Luther nodded once, slow, deliberate, and just like that, the fight truly began. The 17th Precinct did not feel the same. It had only been a few days since the night Luther Grant had been forced into a squad car, shoved into a holding cell, dismissed as nothing more than another black man who did not belong where he stood. But already, the atmosphere inside these walls had shifted. The arrogance had faded. The easy confidence of unchecked power had been replaced with something colder, something sharper, fear. The investigation had arrived in full force. Federal auditors had taken over the precinct's main conference room, their presence looming over the station like an approaching storm. Internal Affairs investigators moved through the halls like vultures, combing through files, pulling officers aside for interviews that stretched for hours. Every desk, every filing cabinet, every digital record that had once gone unchecked was now being examined, dissected, cross-referenced. The officers who had once spoken with such casual authority moved differently now, their steps quieter, their backs less straight, their voices carrying none of the false confidence they had once wielded like a weapon. And in the center of it all, Luther Grant walked through those same halls, not as a prisoner, but as a reckoning. The air shifted as he moved. Some officers looked away as he passed, their gazes avoiding his as though afraid to meet the eyes of the man they had once laughed at, once dismissed, once thought they could break. Others watched him with unease, their expressions tight, their hands twitching toward their belts or their pockets. Some unconscious instinct to hold on to the power they had spent their entire careers hiding behind. But they no longer held it. Today, Luther Grant held the power. Captain Richard Sloane was waiting for him in his office, his shoulders squared, his face set in something that tried to resemble composure. But Luther could see it, the slight tremor in his hands, the barely restrained tension in his posture. He had spent the past few days making pleas, excuses, calls to men who had once held influence, only to be met with silence. He had delayed the inevitable for as long as possible, but now there was nothing left to do except face what was coming. Luther stepped inside the office without hesitation, his presence unshaken, unmovable. Daniel Harrington had wanted to handle this meeting himself, but Luther had refused. This moment was his. The man who had turned a blind eye to injustice in his own department would answer to him personally. Sloane gestured toward the chair opposite his desk, but Luther remained standing, his presence towering, forcing the captain to sit while he loomed above him. "You wanted to speak to me," Luther said, his voice smooth, controlled. Sloane exhaled through his nose, rubbing a hand over his temple before clearing his throat. "I assume you know why you're here." Luther tilted his head slightly. "Do I?" Sloane's jaw clenched. His fingers tapped lightly against the desk, a nervous tick he could not suppress. "I'm not going to sit here and tell you mistakes weren't made." His voice was tight, deliberate, but Luther could hear the cracks beneath it. "And I'm not going to pretend I didn't ignore things I should have dealt with earlier." A pause, sharp, heavy. "But this department doesn't survive if every officer is thrown to the wolves." Luther exhaled slowly, shaking his head slightly, his disappointment settling into the space between them. "You still don't understand what's happening here." Sloane's lips pressed into a thin line. Luther leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the edge of the desk, his eyes piercing, unrelenting. "This isn't about a few bad officers. This isn't about salvaging what's left of your department. This is about dismantling a system that allows men like Rourke and Kincaid to operate unchecked." His voice did not rise, did not waver. "You let them walk through these halls, knowing what they were. You allowed them to wear that badge, knowing the kind of power they abused. And now, you want to talk about survival?" He tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "You should be worried about your own." Sloane's breath stuttered slightly, because he knew this was not just an internal review. This was not just a few suspensions, a few resignations, a few officers thrown out to appease public outrage. This was bigger. This was a dismantling. Luther straightened, letting the moment stretch before finally speaking again. "You're resigning." Sloane inhaled sharply, his fingers tightening into fists, his last grip on authority slipping. "I haven't." Luther raised an eyebrow. "You are resigning," he repeated, slower this time, his voice carrying the weight of certainty. "Because if you don't, they will remove you publicly, and they will not be kind." Sloane swallowed thickly, his face pale. Because he knew his time was up. Luther held his gaze for another moment before turning, stepping away from the desk, moving toward the door with the same steady pace he had arrived with. But before he left, he paused, glancing over his shoulder. "Clean out your office, Captain." His voice was quiet, almost thoughtful. "While it's still yours to leave." And then he stepped out and walked directly into Rourke and Kincaid. They had been led into the hallway for their final review with Internal Affairs, their faces tighter, paler, stripped of the smug confidence they had once worn so easily. Their uniforms were gone, replaced with civilian clothes that did nothing to hide the weight of what had already been lost. Rourke stiffened immediately at the sight of Luther, his fingers twitching at his sides, his breath uneven. Kincaid's jaw clenched, his nostrils flaring, his body coiled like a man waiting for a fight he already knew he could not win. Luther simply looked at them, not with anger, not with hatred, with certainty. "You thought I'd disappear," he murmured, his voice measured, deliberate, absolute. "You thought that because you had the badge, because you had the power, because you had the weight of a system built to protect you, you could make men like me nothing." His gaze moved between them, unflinching. "But I was never nothing." The words settled like an earthquake beneath their feet. Kincaid exhaled sharply, his breath hitching slightly. Rourke did not speak. Luther exhaled, tilting his head slightly. "You should get used to being on the other side of the system." He gestured toward the Internal Affairs office behind them, where a full investigation into their past conduct was already underway. "You'll be there a while." And then, without another word, he walked past them. Rourke stayed frozen in place. Kincaid swallowed, his hands shaking slightly at his sides, because this was what it felt like to be powerless. And now they understood. The days that followed were a whirlwind of legal maneuvering, press inquiries, and quiet negotiations behind closed doors. The investigation had expanded beyond what anyone had initially expected. What had begun as an inquiry into one precinct's misconduct had snowballed into something much larger, an indictment of an entire system that had allowed officers like Rourke and Kincaid to operate unchecked for years. For Luther, the fight had only just begun. He sat in a private conference room at the Department of Justice, the polished wood table stretching between him and the men and women who had been assigned to build the case that would define the coming months. Federal prosecutors, civil rights attorneys, and Department of Justice officials were gathered, reviewing every piece of evidence, every sworn affidavit, every file that had been dragged into the light. At the head of the table, Daniel Harrington was flipping through a thick binder, his brow furrowed in concentration as he skimmed the latest deposition reports. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head before looking up. "They want you to testify," he said, his voice even, controlled. "Both of you." Luther's gaze flickered toward Claire, seated beside him, her expression unreadable, but he could see the tension in her posture, the way her fingers pressed lightly against the armrest of her chair. Luther exhaled, leaning forward slightly. "Who else?" Harrington shut the binder with a quiet thud. "We've already subpoenaed Captain Sloan. He'll take the stand, though I doubt he'll say much of value. O'Malley is cooperating, likely to save his own skin. As for Rourke and Kincaid," his lips curled slightly, something close to satisfaction. "They don't have a choice. The judge has ruled that their past records are admissible. Once those come out, they're finished." Claire folded her arms, shaking her head. "Finished or not, they still get to sit there, to argue, to act like they're victims in all of this." Her voice was low, tight. "They don't deserve a trial." Luther glanced at her, his expression calm but knowing. "Of course they do." Claire's jaw clenched. Harrington exhaled, glancing at Luther. "They'll try to paint this as a misunderstanding. Say they were just following protocol, that it was an unfortunate mistake, but nothing more. But the pattern of behavior, the paper trail, it's too much for them to escape. Once you testify, once we establish what happened, once the jury sees who you are, their defense will crumble." Luther nodded slowly. He had spent decades watching men like Rourke and Kincaid twist the truth, using the benefit of the doubt as a shield. But this time, there would be no shield. "They'll ask questions," Luther said simply. Harrington nodded. "They will." Luther exhaled, folding his hands together. "Then I'll give them answers." The courtroom was packed. Journalists lined the benches, their cameras flashing before the judge entered, their pens poised to document every second. Behind them, legal analysts whispered into microphones, networks airing live coverage of what was now being called the most significant civil rights case in years. Seated at the defendant's table, Rourke and Kincaid sat in stiff suits, their expressions carefully schooled, their backs straight. Gone were the smirks, the easy arrogance, the weight of assumed protection. Their lawyers murmured quietly beside them, flipping through documents, whispering instructions, but it was clear from the set of their jaws, the way their eyes flickered with unease. They knew they had already lost. Luther Grant sat at the witness stand. His posture was composed, his expression calm, his presence commanding, in the way only a man who had seen the depths of history and survived could be. Harrington stood from his position at the prosecutor's table, buttoning his jacket as he approached the stand, his voice smooth, deliberate, unwavering. "Justice Grant," he began, turning toward the jury. "For the record, please state your name and credentials." Luther inclined his head slightly. "Luther James Grant, retired Supreme Court Justice of the United States." The words settled into the room like a gavel strike. Harrington let them breathe before stepping forward, his tone sharp but steady. "On the night in question, where were you?" Luther didn't blink. "Standing outside the Hamilton restaurant, waiting for my granddaughter." Harrington nodded. "And what happened next?" Luther's voice remained level, unwavering, but each word carried weight. "I was approached by Officers Rourke and Kincaid, who demanded to know why I was loitering. I explained that I was waiting for someone. They did not believe me." His fingers laced together, his gaze locked on Harrington. "I informed them that I was a retired Supreme Court Justice. They dismissed it. I presented no threat. I raised no voice. But they made up their minds before I ever spoke. And then they arrested me." A hush fell over the courtroom. Rourke's lawyer shifted uncomfortably. Kincaid's fingers clenched on the table. Harrington nodded, his expression unreadable. "Did they ask for your identification?" Luther let the silence stretch before answering. "They did not." Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Harrington continued. "Did they read you your rights?" "They did not." More murmurs. Harrington stepped closer, his voice measured, but unyielding. "Did you, at any point, resist arrest?" Luther exhaled slowly. "No." Harrington turned to the jury, pausing briefly before stepping back. No further questions. As he returned to his seat, Rourke's attorney stood, clearing his throat, shuffling his papers as though he had somehow prepared for this moment differently. The defense's questions were predictable. Didn't the officers have reason to believe he was trespassing? Couldn't it have been a simple mistake? Didn't the officers simply act in the best interest of public safety? Luther did not waver. "I was detained because of an assumption," he said, his voice carrying across the courtroom. "An assumption rooted in bias. Because when they saw me, they did not see a citizen. They did not see a professional. They did not see a man waiting for his family." He let the words settle. "They saw what they wanted to see." The attorney shifted slightly, his expression faltering. Luther continued. "The officers who arrested me did not see me as a person. They saw me as a problem. That is why I was handcuffed. That is why I was thrown into the back of a squad car. That is why I sat in a holding cell for hours, while they laughed and dismissed my words." The silence that followed was deafening. The attorney exhaled slowly, realizing there was no way to undo what had just been spoken. There was no defense strong enough to erase the weight of those words. He turned toward the judge. "No further questions." As Luther stepped down from the stand, he did not look at Rourke or Kincaid, because they no longer mattered. The verdict was already written in the air. And for the first time in a long time, justice was truly in motion. The verdict had been reached. Guilty. The word settled over the courtroom with the weight of finality, reverberating through the air, filling the silence that followed with something undeniable, unshakable, absolute. There was no celebration, no applause, only the quiet, inevitable recognition that the men who had once acted without consequence had finally been forced to face one. For Rourke and Kincaid, there was no escaping it. The charges: civil rights violations, unlawful detainment, abuse of power, had not been brushed aside, had not been softened, had not been reduced to a suspension disguised as punishment. They had lost. The badge had not saved them. Their uniforms had not protected them. And, for the first time in their lives, they were the ones forced to answer to a system they had once manipulated without fear. Luther Grant remained seated as the judge prepared to deliver sentencing. He did not gloat. He did not celebrate. He simply watched, knowing that this moment was bigger than two men, bigger than one precinct, bigger than one courtroom. This was the first step. Judge William Thatcher, a man known for his unwavering stance on civil rights and legal accountability, settled his gaze on the defendants. His voice carried the weight of history. "Officers Rourke and Kincaid," he began, his tone firm, deliberate, leaving no room for misinterpretation. "This court finds your actions not only unconstitutional, but a disgrace to the profession you swore to uphold. The misuse of power you displayed was not an isolated incident, nor was it a simple lapse in judgment. It was part of a pattern of abuse that has now been exposed for all to see." The silence in the room was deafening. "Therefore, this court sentences you both to 10 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole." A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery, but the judge was not finished. "In addition, you will each pay a fine of $150,000, which will be distributed among civil rights organizations specializing in police accountability and wrongful incarceration cases." Kincaid's face drained of color. Rourke's fists clenched, his jaw tightening, his breathing uneven. But neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to say. Luther exhaled slowly, his face calm, unreadable, as the reality settled over the men who had once laughed at him in a squad car, who had treated his dignity like a joke, who had acted as though he were nothing. Now, they were the ones who were nothing. As the judge's gavel slammed down one last time, the officers who had once worn their uniforms like armor were led away in handcuffs. Justice had spoken, but the fight was not over. 3 weeks later, at the 17th Precinct, the atmosphere inside was not the same. Gone were the officers who had once carried themselves with untouchable arrogance. Gone were the quiet jokes made at the expense of the powerless. Gone was the confidence that no matter what they did, nothing would change. In their place was a silence that carried weight. The department had been gutted. Internal Affairs had completed their review, and the results had been devastating. Nearly a third of the officers had either resigned, been placed under investigation, or outright dismissed. Federal oversight had stepped in to ensure that this department, once an unchecked machine of systemic abuse, would never operate the same way again. Captain Richard Sloan had not been spared. His resignation had been swift, quiet, and final. He had spent weeks making calls to allies who no longer wanted to be associated with him, submitting desperate appeals to keep his pension, attempting to salvage what was left of a reputation that had already crumbled. None of it mattered. His name had become synonymous with failure, and by the time he had finally signed his resignation letter, it had already been too late to negotiate. His consequences, however, did not stop there. He had agreed to a plea deal with the DOJ, admitting to willful negligence in exchange for avoiding criminal charges. His pension was cut by 50%, his severance package revoked, and he was barred from ever holding another position in law enforcement. A permanent stain on his record, ensuring that wherever he went, whatever career he tried to rebuild, he would never hold authority over another person again. Luther stood inside the precinct for the first time since that night, his posture straight, his gaze sweeping the empty desks, the stacks of case files being reviewed by federal auditors, the officers who remained moving through the halls like ghosts of a department that no longer existed the way it once had. Claire stood beside him, arms crossed, her expression unreadable as she took it all in. "Hard to believe this is the same place," she murmured, her voice even, though he could hear the undercurrent of emotion beneath it, the anger that had not faded, the fight that still burned inside her. "You really did it?" Luther exhaled, his voice smooth, firm, unwavering. "We did it." She glanced at him, her sharp eyes studying him, but she didn't argue. Instead, she exhaled, shaking her head slightly. "Do you think they actually understand what happened here?" Luther tilted his head slightly. "Some do. And the others?" He let the silence stretch before answering, his gaze sweeping over the remaining officers, the ones who had survived the purge, but now walked with uncertainty in their steps. "They will." The fight was not over. If anything, it had only just begun. The next day, that truth became even clearer. The steps of the federal courthouse were lined with reporters, their cameras flashing, their microphones stretched toward the podium where Department of Justice officials stood, flanked by civil rights attorneys and legal representatives. At the center of it all, Daniel Harrington adjusted his tie, stepping toward the microphone with the weight of something irreversible pressing into the moment. "This is not an isolated case," he began, his voice clear, controlled, cutting across the morning air like the first crack of a storm. "What happened at 17th Precinct is a reflection of a much larger issue, one that extends beyond a single city, beyond a single department. This is systemic. This is deeply rooted, and this will be addressed." The journalists fired questions, their voices overlapping, but Harrington remained unshaken. "In the coming months, federal oversight will extend into additional precincts where patterns of misconduct have been identified. Grand jury investigations are already underway, and multiple officers in surrounding jurisdictions are facing pending indictments." What happened in this courtroom was not an ending. It was the start of something much bigger. Luther watched from the sidelines, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. He had stood before more judges than he could count. He had written decisions that had shaped the very foundations of civil rights law. But now, standing on the steps of a courthouse, watching the justice system move in a way it had rarely moved before, he felt something he had not felt in years. Momentum. Justice had moved. And tomorrow, it would move again. As Luther walked down the courthouse steps, the sun casting long shadows behind him, he did not stop, because there was still work to be done, and he was not finished yet. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends, and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great